meetings, as people who regularly attend know, but it's a great feel, so we're super excited. Really just to start us off, since we have so many new people here, I kind of wanted to start off with what our club is and what we do. So we're part of a Christian organization at Mines called Ratio Christi, which stands for the Reason of Christ. And we have our little symbol up there. And so we are one of the many ministries at Mines, and we focus on apologetics. And can anybody give me a good short definition of what apologetics is? Pretty much. So what we focus on is the idea of what we believe and why we believe it as Christians. And then to further that, how do you discuss that with others? And that includes defending it, talking about it. And so we really enjoy lessons like tonight where we can learn more about how truth and reality and science all point to a creator and all point to God. And then further that, the God that we believe in as Christians. And so we're excited for tonight's talk. Kind of outside of our club, with just general announcements for students at Mines, there's really no big announcements coming up other than we will not be meeting next week on campus because of President's Day. So no meeting, we'll meet in 2 weeks, and we'll send out information on what that meeting is going to be about. But as for tonight, as you all probably know, we have Steve Laufmann coming to talk. Steve is part of the Discovery Institute in Colorado. He's got 40 years of experience as a systems engineer, and then he got his master's from University of Washington. He'll give you a little more info about what he does and why it's important and relevant. But before we start, I'll just pray us in. And if you have any questions about the club or what we do at Mines, please stop by after, talk to myself or Donald in the back, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So if you don't mind, bow your heads and pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for the blessing and how you've provided for us. Thank you for this building, and when plans change that we could still meet here and have this club to honor and worship you. Thank you for each person who took time out of their schedule to come meet with us tonight. Thank you for Steve, who took time out of his schedule to come speak. Lord, we praise you for the truth you've revealed to us and how every part of reality is just screaming out your name. I pray that you would help us to realize that tonight. Open our hearts to hear what you have to say. Open our minds to remember what we are taught and the truth within it. And then further, Lord, give us a fire to apply it. Please help us to really want to tell people about this and to remember it and apply it in our own lives so that it doesn't just get put away in the bookshelf, but rather it will be preached out anywhere we go. So bless us tonight, Lord, and thank you for each person here and the community we can have in this building. In Jesus' name, amen.
So we're going to test this. Can you hear me? I'm sorry for you. There's nothing for it. So this is going to be for Q&A afterwards. I'm going to stand up here because the light's better. Makes me feel really important. And I don't get to do that very often. So I have to say, I thought apologetics was what you did when your wife is mad at you and you don't know why. But I could be wrong. So we're going to talk tonight about the 2 hardest engineering problems in the universe. And I've never heard anyone talk about them in that way before. But since it's an engineering school, it just seemed like the right thing to do. Because it's true. So a little bit about me. Anyway, I'm a computer scientist. I did AI research when I was a kid, for the first 10 or 15 years of my career, mostly in industrial research labs. And then for the last years, I've been an enterprise architect. So an enterprise architect is somebody who addresses the challenges of thousands of systems in a large organization, corporation, government agency. So I was a principal architect with Quest Communications, and I had all of their national network systems for engineering, oddly enough, and had a lot of fun with that. I think I was responsible for about 2,000 systems at the time. I have no idea what most of those were. Most of them were under the radar. Nobody knew what they were. So it makes life a lot interesting when you don't understand and you're still responsible. So, but I wanted to point out that I have this personality defect. Whenever I see a system, I always approach that system with this basic question: how would I build a system that does that? So that's what led me into living systems, because I did information systems forever, and frankly, they get kind of boring. I mean, they're all the same. They all have the same problems, but living systems are not. They're really, really interesting. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I did want to clarify one misconception that I know a lot of you have had. I am not the smartest guy in the world. Okay, it's true. My wife and I were having one of those, my beautiful wife in the purple back here, who's going to hit me later. We were having one of those conversations, where the decibel level goes up over time. And I know none of you have ever done this before, but I finally just admitted, I said, all right, I admit it. I am not the smartest guy in the world. But I think I should get some credit for being in the top 10. And that, I scored no points with that. So let's move right along. So there's the book. Buy the book. My editor and my publisher say, buy the book. Buy lots of books. Buy more books than you can stand. Give them to all your friends and family. We're trying to break even on the costs. This turns out it's published by Discovery Institute Press. It turns out to be the largest and most expensive book they've ever published in-house. So I don't think they were ready for what we gave them. But it takes two approaches to looking at the body. The first is a medical approach. Sorry, I'm going to turn my timer on because otherwise you'll be here all night. The second is an engineering approach, and we spent 5 years writing this book. It took us a long time to figure out how to merge those two perspectives in a book that's semi-rational. But I think we did a pretty good job. So if you read the reviews on Amazon, they're all but one of them so far are pretty positive and very thoughtful. So I encourage you to get the book, read the book. If you like what I talk about here, there's a whole lot more in there. Alrighty, so first of all, what are the two hardest problems in the universe? Aside from figuring out what women want. But we're not going to go down that path because I'm an engineer and I have not the slightest idea. So the medical perspective is that there are so many things that have to be just right in the body. My co-author is a hospice physician. He's an expert on how the body fails. That's a really interesting perspective. And it tells you a lot about what it takes to keep the body alive. So I won't go through all this stuff. There's chemical parameters, physiological parameters, and especially dynamic capacities. No one ever thinks about this. But your lungs are perfectly designed to give you exactly the oxygen you need at minimum rest. So when you're sleeping, their lowest capacity is exactly what you need for that level of activity. And then when you're out running and exerting very hard energy, working really hard, it will produce exactly at its maximum, exactly the amount of oxygen you need. It's really quite amazing. And it happens, it's true for every human being, at least when they're young. Things can happen when you get older, but no matter how big you are. So different sized bodies, everyone has this property and it's always in place. It's pretty amazing. From the engineering perspective, we know a couple of things for sure. You have to solve every single one of these problems, the medical problems, and you have to solve every one of them all the time, or you're dead. Death is really very, very close. So death, the definition of death is equilibrium with the environment. If your body comes to equilibrium with the environment, that means you're dead. Okay, so there's a lot of parameters that have to reach equilibrium, but we won't go into that. We do talk about two properties here that are really important. Coherent systems, which is where you have a lot of parts that all do something special. They're made out of different materials maybe. There may be different shapes, and they're connected in really special ways. And if any of that organization, the coherence, is not present, that system won't work. Interdependence is where systems depend on each other. So if your cells need oxygen, they have to get oxygen from your respiratory system. But they can't get oxygen from your respiratory system because they're in your foot. So they need your cardiovascular system to pump blood with oxygen in it to your foot. But it turns out the cells in your lungs also need the cardiovascular system. The cells in the cardiovascular system also need the cells in the respiratory system. So how do you build things gradually when they're interdependent? And you'll see when we get into this that there's a lot of examples of that. So the last thing we're going to talk about tonight is causal hurdles. So when you think about these issues, these questions, these are causal hurdles. If you're going to build a human body from nothing, you have to solve all these problems. So how could you do that gradually? And we're not saying that it has to happen all at once. We're just saying it has to happen based on science alone. It has to happen in large jumps. And Mr. Darwin, or as I call him, Chuck said it all has to be gradual. If there's anything that can't happen gradually, then my theory will fall apart. And I hope we're going to demonstrate tonight that his theory is well and truly fallen apart. So, one thing, this is the don't be fooled slide. Just because life is so common in our planet and it's so pervasive, it doesn't mean that life is easy. Okay, I think people get confused by that. It's like the planet Earth. It's like God dropped one drop of life and just boom. Life is everywhere we look. But that's not true anywhere other than Earth. So it takes a lot of problem solving to be alive. Or as Michael Denton said, life is the greatest discontinuity in the universe. It's how you get from non-life to life. Absolutely no idea. Science can't solve that problem because science doesn't even know what life is. All right, so cellular, I'm going to go into an example here just in a little bit of depth so you can get a feel for this. We do a couple of dozen examples like this in the book, so there's a lot more where this came from. So cellular respiration. The way your body maintains its separate equilibrium is it needs energy. It's always burning energy. You need energy for everything. Even when you're sleeping, you have sodium, potassium pumps in about 1 million in every one of your 30 trillion cells. And those things are constantly working to keep the cell's equilibrium different from the fluid outside the cell. So that it takes a lot of work. But I wanted to show you the formula because it sort of makes sense. And just from looking at the formula, you can start to see the problems that have to be solved to be alive. So you have glucose, which is C6H12O6. And you combine that with 6 oxygen molecules, O2. And from that, you get 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, plus energy, plus heat. Okay, so what are the problems? Well, you got to get that glucose molecule from somewhere. You got to get oxygen from somewhere. It turns out carbon dioxide, if it's allowed to build up in your body, it will kill you. So you got to get rid of that. And then water. What are you going to do with all this water? You're just generating water like crazy. I'm an old guy. I know what that means. But it's interesting because it takes 23 separate enzymes in 3 different places inside of your cell to do that, to make that happen. 23 steps in a very specific process. So if you haven't studied molecular biology, this is probably new to you, but 23 is a lot of stuff. So every one of those enzymes has a specific function, and it does solves a specific problem in the pathway to turn the upper line into the lower line. So that just tells you there's all kinds of problems that have to be solved. I got to get oxygen. Every cell needs oxygen. I have to get rid of carbon dioxide. Every cell's generating carbon dioxide. Where's it going to go? So we spend actually a few chapters on respiration in the book, so you can go into this in a lot more detail if you want. But there's a problem here. So if you're a bacteria and you live in the water somewhere, it's like you're an island of life. You can get everything you want from the water that surrounds you. Everything you need. It's like living inside of a grocery store. Everything's there. But when you get to a multicellular organism like a human body, it's like being in a continent. Almost nothing has access to the water, and nothing has access to the environment. So what are you going to do? If you have an average human body has something a bit over 30 trillion cells. How are you going to get oxygen to every one of those cells? There's a set of hard problems there. I mean, the cells in your cornea don't even have blood vessels next to them. How do they get oxygen? It's an interesting problem. So if living in an island of life has hard problems to solve, if you live in a continent, you have crazy hard problems to solve. So this is a little picture of the respiratory system showing you all the parts. The two little things at the bottom are like expanded views. I won't go into this, but there's an amazing number of parts. They all have to be there. They all have to work right, or you can't breathe. Breathing is good. I see several of you doing it even as I'm speaking. And importantly, breathing is automated. So you don't have to think about breathing unless you want to. So respiration also requires controls. So you have to have all kinds of control systems. How does your body know how much oxygen you need at any given time? How does it know where to send that oxygen? How does it get that oxygen out of the environment and put it into the blood? So all control systems have sensors, signaling, logic, and effectors. So you have to be able to detect whatever it is you want to control. If you couldn't detect oxygen in your bloodstream, you wouldn't know that you needed more oxygen. If you could detect oxygen but not at the levels that your body needs, you wouldn't know when you needed more oxygen. So signaling just means that there's distance. So you have oxygen sensors in the blood vessels, the arteries leading to your brain. They're the most important things in your body. If your brain's not getting enough oxygen, you're not going to last more than a couple more minutes. So they need to be really, really good. In fact, there's a whole separate system that just does blood to your brain because it's so essential. Anyway, so at the bottom here is alveolar ventilation. You can use that at parties. It's great. The women love that when you say that word. I know these guys up in the front here. They're writing notes. So this is alveolar ventilation. It means that the alveoli are little sacs inside your lungs. They're little tiny microscopic. You have millions of them in your lungs. And that's where the oxygen comes out of the air and goes into the blood, and the carbon dioxide exits the blood and goes back into the air. So you exhale higher density carbon dioxide and you inhale higher density oxygen. Okay? So is that enough? So I know you can't read this. I can't read it either. Well, so there's this problem, and engineers do this all day long. If I have a problem to solve, I break it down into subproblems, and if I can solve all the subproblems and assemble those solutions in some way, maybe I can solve the problem I started with. I mean, that's the way engineers work. If you look at an iPhone or an Atlas V rocket, that's exactly what happened when engineers designed those systems. So the point here, I don't think I have a laser pointer on this, and it wouldn't work on a TV anyway. So, but what you see in the upper left corner is the starting problem. Every cell requires oxygen for respiration. All the energy in your body is generated inside the cells. It's also consumed inside the cells. But they all need oxygen. But there's another problem. Most cells are in the body's interior, and so they don't have direct access to oxygen. So you got two problems you have to solve. You have to deliver oxygen to every cell in the body, and you have to get oxygen out of the environment and put it in the blood. So you can just walk through this, and the little blue boxes, which you can't read, the yellow boxes are the problems. The blue boxes are the solutions. And you see in here the central nervous system, the gastrointestinal system, the cardiovascular system. You can see things like your rib cage and muscles that in your diaphragm that create a vacuum and pull air in. So what you see is there's a lot of problems that have to be solved, and if you don't solve every single one of those problems, you can't live. So how do you build something like that gradually? Well, engineers don't know how to do that. So the two hardest problems in the universe, one is being alive. I'm going to show you why it's the hardest problem. And the other is reproducing. How in the world do you make another human? Or even if you're just a lowly bacteria, how do you make another bacteria? It's a really hard problem. So we're mostly going to focus on the first one here. We'll talk about reproduction off and on. But by the way, we've been criticized. This book has been criticized because it's not a romance. And I've tried to tell people there's like 3 chapters on sexual reproduction. Again, I'm an engineer, but I think that's romantic. Actually, sexual reproduction is absolutely astounding. You know, you can make a unique individual through sexual reproduction. You can't do that. A bacteria can't make a unique child bacteria. It makes a copy of itself. It makes a clone. But with sexual reproduction, you can make unique individuals. And I think that's really important if you're a Christian, because you are unique. And that was designed in from the very beginning. All righty. So here's the requirements for life, and there's just a little bit on the lower right-hand side is the reproduction, a bit on reproduction. But I know you can't read this, and I can't either. So, but I just I'm going to get up here close so I can actually read a little bit of it to you. I want you to feel the impact of this. These are functional requirements. These are not nice to have. These are the things you have to have, or you don't exist. All right. So there's enclosure. You have to be able to separate components and isolate materials. You have enclosures in your cells. You have enclosures inside the enclosures inside your cells. You have enclosures inside your body. You have organs that have enclosures around them. And you have your body. So your entire body is enclosed. And in fact, your gastrointestinal tract is continuous so that stuff that you eat doesn't just kind of wander around aimlessly inside your body, because that could be bad. If you've ever had my tuna surprise, you'll get that. I'm not talking about what the surprise is. You need to harvest materials from the environment, lots and lots of different materials. You need transport and delivery. You need factories. You need waste recycling and disposal. You need supply chain management. You need chemistry management for many chemicals. You need energy management. You need heat management. You need to be able to make a lot of different kinds of materials. You need structure, shape, and size. You know, every one of your bones has a different shape, size, and especially at the joints, it has a very precise contours to it. And the vertebrae in your back are especially obvious. Every one of them is different, and every one of them works perfectly. Motion and strength, fluid dynamics for you hydraulic engineers out there. You need to defend. You need to heal and repair. You need adaptation. So when your food sources, when you can't get glucose, what do you use to generate energy? Your body has a system for that. It's like a backup system. let's see, signaling and communication, you have optimization, you have physiological controls. You know, your blood pressure has to be just right. Some of you know that when your blood pressure is bad, bad things happen. So if your blood pressure gets really, really bad, you don't need food anymore. You need to be able to do coordination. So, you know, how many muscles does it take to be controlled precisely to do this? I don't know, probably a dozen. So how do you do that? And finally, you need logic and computation. So there's information all over in your body. You have to do logic. So your eyes, your ears, they're doing all kinds of true calculations. So if you're taking the differential equations course, you could be studying the body and applying all that stuff. So there's a lot going on in the body. I'm not going to go into the reproduction stuff. That's a lot of stuff. So if you're an engineer, how are you going to solve this? Well, this is actually pretty simple. You say, I'm going to build some processes. So we talk about all these in the book at some point or another. So I have a homeostasis. That means maintaining my separate equilibrium. I have what we call beyond homeostasis, balance, movement, sight, vision, hearing. Things like that are other systems that actually work as processes. And then there's life cycles. So I've got a human life cycle going from a zygote, a one-celled organism at conception to 30 trillion cells in adulthood. How do you unfold a body plan a little bit at a time, and how do you stay alive while you're doing it? So to do that, I have to have a bunch of capabilities. So these are things like specifications, instructions, timing, metabolism, transport, semantics, information processing, communication, control systems, plans, process definitions, orchestration, and choreography. Well, to do those things, when I'm an engineer and I want to solve the process problems, I need to use, that's like my toolbox. I need to use those things to build solutions, right? Well, those things also need primitives in the toolbox, what I call primitives in my work. They're things like enclosures, sensors, the piece parts that you use to build all this stuff. And then finally, so you're composing solutions as you go up. Finally, you need to get down to chemistry and physics. What materials do I want to use? What makes the most sense? How much of it do I need? How strong does it need to be? So you've got a bunch of questions to answer, right? So you engineering students, you're no doubt working on your own Atlas V rocket in the garage by now, and so you've probably done all this stuff, right? So I'm assuming you're familiar with this. So now let's look at the same chart as if it all happened by accident. So first we're going to take all the same stuff, but we're going to go the other direction. So how do you take chemistry and physics and get an enzyme to emerge? Especially if you need 23 just for cellular respiration. How do you get a sensor to emerge to detect the right levels of oxygen? So once you have those, let's say you need a few thousand different ones, then you can start building things like instructions in metabolism. And then from that, you can start building the things you need to be alive. How many degrees of freedom are involved there? If you had to do this by accident, by trial and error, blind trial and error, never thinking about it, just doing it by accident, how long would it take you to come up with something like a human body? Couple of weeks? I don't know. I think way, way, way longer than the entire history of the universe times several thousand orders of magnitude. I mean, there's just no way you can do this. So engineers know degrees of freedom are not your friend. They're going to kill you eventually. You need to get those under control soon, early in the process. All right, so here's the first law of hard problems. No amount of wishful thinking will make a hard problem go away. Okay, for you engineering students, write this down. It'll come in handy on a final exam someday. Or not. So hard problems resist easy solutions. So now we know we have to find hard solutions to hard problems. So there's a lot more to this, of course, but so let's look at what the solutions are. So this is a little bit about my experience. I sat down and I was thinking about this about a year ago, and it occurred to me that in my career of building systems, designing systems, modifying systems, I've had to solve 4 different kinds of problems. The first is what we call greenfield. I'm going to build a new system from scratch. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So I'm going to build a new system from scratch. Use terms like minimal viable product. And then after a while, it's been around, and now it's called a legacy system, and that means that no one knows how to fix it anymore. And it costs more than you can imagine, and it breaks a lot, and you can't afford to hire people who have old skills to keep it running. So it's a different kind of skill set to keep a legacy system going. So then you have this notion, and this is where I spent most of my career. What do you do when you have to add something to a system of systems that already exists? I'm going to bring in a new system that does something new. What does that mean? How do I have to change the old systems to make this work? What do I have to do to build a new system? And then finally, I have to be able to take a system out. So I have to take a system that is there and is working and just turn it off. Well, it turns out that's a really hard problem, because somebody's going to call your boss and scream at him or her, and you're going to have a bad day if you don't do it well. So where does this happen in life? So we have a minimum viable organism. So maybe a bacteria. There's been a lot of research done on the minimum bacterial life. And then you've got mature systems, and then you've got this notion of adding stuff over time, and then you've got this idea of subtracting stuff. So if you hear the standard evolutionary story that some mammal crawled out of the ocean, developed lungs, had gills, developed lungs, and then later went back into the ocean and developed a blowhole and became a whale, whatever, you got to walk through every one of these problems. How do you add, let's say, echolocation to a human body? How would you do that? Sorry, my mom wants to talk to me. Figures she'd pick tonight. So there's a couple things we can learn from this. So I hope you're kind of getting the feel for, by just looking at this and asking engineer-type questions, you can learn a real lot. So first of all, to do these 2 kinds of things, I need a theory of generation. I need a theory in which things can change. Right? To do the things on the bottom, I need a theory of stasis. How do I keep a legacy system going? That's a stasis problem. I don't want it to change. I want it to stay the same, but I want it to keep working. So that's actually a really hard problem. So any theory of origins has to address these 2 problems: a theory of generation and a theory of stasis. Okay, so let's look at, I keep thinking about these, this happens to me a lot at 4 in the morning. So if you think about generation, you come up with the question, why is anything alive? Why is there anything that's alive? How did that happen? How could it possibly have happened, ever? And the second one is, why isn't everything dead? So those are different questions. But if something was alive, how did it manage to stay alive for a long time? How many generations can you last before your DNA degrades and the information is no longer good enough? So these are both really hard questions, and I think any theory of origins has to be able to address these. So I'm going to skip over these, I think. Coherence axioms. The coherence axioms say that the more parts you have and the more ways that they're interconnected, the harder they are to build and the harder they are to change. So the harder they are to build is the theory of generation. So I've got to overcome these hurdles in order to generate something new that's alive. The coherence axiom 2 says it's very hard to change things. The more parts they have, it gets impossible to change them. So that's resistance to change, and so that points to a theory of stasis. So just so far, this is all just engineering thought experiments. I think we've made a lot of progress so far, and we haven't done any work yet. So let's look at the causal mechanisms. Neo-Darwinism has 4 causal factors. Okay, so those of you who are in school, you've heard this from all of your classes, biology classes, socialism. Yeah, that's probably what they all are anymore, too. So Darwin talked about these. You have variation, which later turned out to turn kind of into random mutations when DNA was discovered. Heritability, so you have descent. You can pass these changes on to your offspring. You have natural selection, which is supposed to kill off the offspring that aren't any good and preserve the ones that are. And then you have time. And so as engineers, we look at this and we say, I don't see a theory of generation there. What can generate something new there? Nothing. What can allow, where's stasis? There's no place for stasis here either. What there is, and for engineers this will be important, time is where entropy lives. So if you have a lot of time, a lot of things are going to go wrong. And the life that you had, if you were able to achieve it in the first place, is going to fall apart and fail. So the interesting observation is that you have a precondition for variations. You can't have variations in your system until the system exists. So you have to be alive before Darwin can do anything. Kind of a problem. The second is heritability requires you to reproduce. Well, those are the 2 hardest problems in the universe. So for Darwinism requires the 2 hardest problems to be solved by accident before it can do anything. I just think that's kind of an aha. If your biology professors can't give you a solution to that, then I would say, do what you need to for the exam, move on. So you see, there's no causal sufficiency. There's no theory of generation or stasis, and all the hard problems are prerequisites. So let's look. So this is Stephen Jay Gould, who passed away a few years ago. He made a really interesting statement. He said, revolutions usually begin as replacements for older certainties. Right? What's the older certainty for us? Neo-Darwinism in all of its shapes and forms. Man, if you talk to biologists, you could get shot for disagreeing on this. And several people have lost their jobs over this kind of disagreement. But let's look at a new theory. So we propose this in the book. We don't go very far with it. We just sort of introduce it. We have a conference coming up in June if anyone wants to play. We're going to have a very small working conference in Texas. If you're interested, contact me, and my contact info is available at the end. And we might even have some scholarships. So, but we're working on this theory, and it involves some new causal factors that Darwinism doesn't allow or doesn't consider or doesn't even know about. The first is intentional acts. If you are a theist, Christian, that should sound really familiar. But it doesn't have to be God. I mean, all we know from a scientific perspective is somebody had to intend what happened. Right? So intention, I think, is the key. It's a really important thing because you cannot build an Atlas rocket unless you were planning to build an Atlas rocket. Okay, they just don't pop out of the ether. So the next is internal capabilities and programming. We believe that virtually all of the changes that have been observed by biologists, the little petri dish experiments you did in 8th grade science, that those are organisms changing themselves. It's not evolution in action. And there's a lot of research coming out the last 15 years or so that points in this direction, although you probably haven't heard about it. The third one is design properties. So we know that systems, the way you architect systems, the way you design systems, the patterns that you use, the principles that you use, affects how they can change over their life cycle. So, for instance, modularity is really a big deal. Even the U.S. Navy is building ships that are modular now because they can't afford to bring them back into dry dock every time a new computer gets invented, right? So even the walls are movable. It's like that modular office furniture. They're doing that in naval ships now because it's the right design principle. It gives you a lot of power. And the last one is degradation. We know that degradation happens. We're engineers. We see it. Your car doesn't run as well as it did 10 years ago. Your TV, it can't even get a signal anymore if it's 10 years old. All right, so let's look at the theory of biological design and the causal factors there. So I don't have time to go into this. This is all in the book. It's in chapter 22. It's a great chapter. It's a beautiful chapter. But we talk about the same questions. What are the preconditions? What are the capabilities and limitations of each of these factors? But I'm going to keep going. So we have specific mechanisms here. So they're just as specific as the ones that Darwin touted. They are causally sufficient. They offer a theory of generation plus a theory of stasis. And they're limited. The limitations of this theory are they're only based on the capabilities of the designer. Whoever the designer is, that designer is really good at math and really good engineer. And it's just, we as humans have no idea how to be that good. So, all right, so let's go. So there's natural causes and intentional causes. There's no third class. Those are the only two kinds of causes you can have, natural causes and intentional causes. Nothing else to find, although there are a lot of scientists looking for something because natural causes can't do it and intentional causes aren't allowed. So they're stuck. Causal attribution. I just wanted to show you this because it's not necessary for everything that we see today to have been made exactly the way we see it today. Things change. We probably have change mechanisms in our bodies that no one's even looking for. So how would those work? So we have this sort of scale between things that are fully intentional, things that are fully organic, and then things that are sort of in between. So there's some intended outcomes and some that are just letting the program run. So if you're a programmer, you know what this is like. Sometimes you just let the program run and see what it does. If you're like me, when I was an undergraduate, it usually crashes. But, if you're a better designer than me, it probably doesn't crash. So what happens in an ecosystem when you have lots of different organisms working together in an ecosystem and changing and modifying the environment? The set of questions gets really interesting, and I think some of you here may, at some point, decide this looks like a fun place to go work for my career. If you think that, give me a call. The sticking point. There is a sticking point in this new theory. I mean, let's face it. Miracles are okay. Darwinists love miracles. They expect them to happen all the time. They expect to overcome the theory of probability all the time. They get 23 perfect enzymes, with odds of maybe just one of them, getting just one of them might be 1 divided by 10 to the 150th power. So how do you get 23 of them? Well, that would be a miracle. Well, they're okay with that. They don't mind miracles. What they hate is intention. So intention is the sticking point. So we have a section in the book on the difference between engineering and miracles. We use some of C.S. Lewis's work. It's really good stuff. I encourage you to read it when you buy a dozen books. All right, so why is this important? So we're getting down to the really nitty-gritty of this. There's sort of this central question in life. And if you get the answers wrong, you're going to have a horrible life. Okay? And the question is, am I a cosmic accident? Or was I intended? Or at least was my body intended? I mean, my wife says that she can't really imagine anyone intending me specifically. But, maybe for you guys it's, not a problem. But this is like the question. If you get this wrong, your life can go south really fast. So let's just kind of think it through. So Darwinism says I'm a cosmic accident, right? There's no intention, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, there's no free will. I'm just an accident. But you know what? So are you. So if I'm an accident and you're an accident and there's no meaning and there's no value, who cares what I do to you? Who cares if I abort a baby? Who cares if I take a gun out and shoot a canine dog across the street? Who cares? It doesn't matter. There's no value, there's no meaning. It's unimportant. So what that leads to is, I know this will be a shock, tribal politics. Everything's tribal. Who matters to you is someone who can do something for you, or maybe your kids. But maybe not them either. However, if you go the other way, was I intended? Am I here for a reason? Is there value in my existence? Is there purpose? Do I really have free will? Can I choose? Not just a meat machine, but I can make my own choices. So that leads to a very different life. And if you're a biblical theist like me, then that means it sort of throws down the gauntlet. I got to find out why I'm here. So that's actually a really hard problem too. What am I doing here? What am I here for? Is there some reason for me to be here? And maybe part of that reason is to care for other people. So you see how this leads to completely different outcomes. It comes from different worldviews. There is no God. There's nothing outside the material stuff of the universe. Or there's a transcendent God who intended all this stuff to be here. And so start from completely different places, and you end up in completely opposite places. And my personal belief is, we don't go into this in the book, but my personal belief is that this question right here is at the heart of 90% of the anger and division in our society today. You can clearly see people landing on different sides of this and behaving completely differently. All right, so I just went through some of this. I'm not going to hammer on it too much more, but there's one thing I learned. I don't know if you all are familiar with Francis Schaeffer, who's a Christian theologian, philosopher from did most of his work in the 70s and 80s. At least that's when I was reading his stuff before he passed away. And he asked a question that I have never forgotten, and it's really been central to my thinking ever since. And I tried to teach this to my kids when they were growing up. When you're shopping for worldviews, ask yourself if the people who are espousing a worldview can live consistently with their own worldview. And if they can't, maybe you ought to go shopping somewhere else. So could you live with the notion that you are a meat machine, that you have no free will, that you have no inherent value, that you have no purpose, that you're a mere accident. Can you live consistently with that? Well, I would argue that if the notion of someone breaking into your house and raping your teenage daughter bothers you, then I don't think you can live consistently with the materialist worldview, because there should be nothing wrong with that, because there's no such thing as wrong. Right? There's no value. There's no right or wrong. There's no moral compass. So if you come from that tradition, I think I can't recommend that you do this. I did it once in one of my class, my sociology class or socialism class, whatever it was. I challenged my professor along these lines, and he did not like that. I don't think that was my best grade ever. But I think that's a reasonable challenge to make. Can you live, if you believe that X is true, can you live in a way that's logically consistent with what you claim you believe? And if you can't, then you really don't believe it. So anyway, it's a great way if you're working with someone who buys into this worldview, that it's a great way to sort of break down some walls and get the conversation going. They will vehemently argue with you, which is, means you're basically winning. So I'd encourage you to think about that. So just a couple more things. So our book and the work that we're doing in our engineering research group at the Discovery Institute is to explore. We want to explore living systems. We want to understand how they work. We want to understand what questions we should even be asking, because we don't think the right questions are being asked, much less, much less answered. And only by better understanding how things work can we come to a really good understanding of where they came from. I mean, if you don't understand what you got, how can you claim categorically that you know where it came from? You don't even know how it works. So we also want to equip people with better tools. If you don't know what questions to ask, you can swallow an awful lot of stuff that someone else is pitching at you. And you should be dissatisfied with answers that look a lot like hand-waving or storytelling or blowing smoke. And, if you've been in a biology class and challenged the professor, you know what that looks like. And importantly, and I think this probably is the heart of the mission for me personally, is we really want people to be set free from their bondage to materialist philosophy, from this worldview that they're an accident. You don't have to buy that. The answers, there are better answers out there. We don't know what all of them are, but there are better answers out there. So we just want to release people from the shackles of materialist philosophy and let them start exploring life with a little bit of joy and seeking answers that have never been, to questions that have never even been asked before. So I think a lot of us know, we have a lot of students in the room here, but a lot of us that are older either have, with our children or with our grandchildren, had this experience where they love Jesus and they go off to university, and 2 semesters later they come back and they're fully indoctrinated atheists. And that is completely unnecessary. So my personal mission is to help churches prepare kids for what they're going to get hit with when they get to universities or out into the job market. They're not ready. They don't know how to ask better questions. They don't know how to stand toe-to-toe with their professors. And that's very doable, because all you have to do is ask questions. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to show them that they don't have the answers either. So I just don't think that's necessarily very hard. It may be very hard on your GPA. I'm just saying, you might want to, if you're going to go into biology, Mike Behe, I don't know if you're familiar with Mike Behe. Mike Behe said one night when he was at Colorado Christian University speaking, one of the students asked him, so I want to go into a career in biology, what should I do? And Mike Behe said, Mom's the word, Don't tell anybody until you've got at least got out of school, and maybe until you've got tenure. So just don't try to take everybody on, but there's some people you might want to take on. So certainly, like your neighbors. Have you ever talked with somebody over coffee in your kitchen, or out at the patio over a barbecue, and they're just at a loss? They don't know where life is taking them. They feel lost, and they're buying into this story that they're a cosmic accident. They may not be able to articulate that, but they've bought that line, and it's dragging them down. It doesn't happen right away, but it's continuous. It's pulling them down, and it's wearing on people. So, we can help people, enlighten people, help them to see that whole thing is completely unnecessary. So don't fall for it. And then a lot of us ourselves have deep unanswered questions about this stuff. Am I a cosmic accident? Am I here on purpose? Was I intended? If you haven't settled those questions for yourself, then maybe that's a good place to start. Now, there's a lot of materials that would help with that. Our book is designed to help with that, but there's a lot of other materials too. And I should mention we have the Colorado chapter of Discovery Institute's Society for Science and Culture Network has a table in the back with a lot of books. This book is for sale back there. Sadly, we can only take cash or checks, but I would be happy to sign that for you if you'd like. But you do have to sign a waiver that with my signature, the resale value goes way down, way down. So with that, I think I've gone 2 minutes over. So I love this guy. He's not a real impressive guy, but I love what he said. If most answers seem obvious in retrospect, maybe we're not spending enough time searching for the obvious. And that's what I think this is. I think our bodies, from the moment of birth, have been screaming to us that we're designed, that we're intended, that we have a place in the universe that's very special, and we've been taught to ignore it. And that's just so sad. So there's my email address. I give you my phone number, but I don't answer my phone. So does anyone have any? Oh, I should mention, if you want a copy of the book, it's with tax, it's $27.90. So there's some of our people are in the back. Yeah, Betsy's back there waving. They're back there, and you can pick up a copy tonight. Also, you can get them on Amazon. Every once in a while, they sell them for $1 off. So it's been out for 2 months now, and it's been on sale like 5 times. So you can wait and save $1. Up to you. All right, questions? So there is a mic up here. So yeah, let's put that. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I'll start us off since I'm already up here. There was that list of systems way at the beginning of your presentation, in particular the ones that corresponded with life and how all those things needed to be fulfilled in order for life to exist.
Right.
How did you come to the conclusion that was the list? And I suspect that it was by no means an exhaustive one.
No, it's definitely not exhaustive. I do these things until I get exhausted, and then I quit, which turns out takes less and less time the older I get. I don't know how to do this with this clicker to go back, but if I go back to that list, there it is. So no, it's the one before that. So it's that one right there, right? So part of that's just through reading. So our research group, we have guys reading a lot of papers, biological research literature and related. And a lot of these are just straight off the list for minimal life. the smallest, simplest bacteria that's known to be alive and able to reproduce has a fair number of these properties required as well. So, but when you get to a huge multicellular organism like the human body, these problems get way harder. And so, we're just going through most of these problems we talk about in our book. So this is actually from chapter 18, 19. It's right in that area somewhere. And it's basically a summary of all the things we've covered in the book. So we go through and capture this summary of all this stuff. These are the things we talk about. There's one that's not on here, which I think is really telling. And that is, I live inside of one of these things. How did I get in here? You know, so one of our colleagues wrote an article a while back. It said, you know, one of the things biologists, a question they never seem to ask is, how did I get inside of one of these? You know, I know there's a me. I know that. It's very obvious to me that I exist, that I'm separate from my body. But nobody's even talking about where that comes from, except for the church, of course. All right, does that help? So feel free to join us, and you can add to the list. They'll give you something to do in between classes. Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that earlier, you talked about that there were experiments and research that suggested that organisms were changing themselves. I was just wondering, does this mean you don't think microevolution exists at all, or does it mean, or how is organisms changing themselves different than microevolution? Also, yeah.
Okay, so that's a good question, and you know, I'm stalling while I make up an answer.
It's okay to say if you don't know.
No, this comes up a lot. So it depends on what you mean by microevolution. But let me explain what the research shows. Okay, so it's really clear that certain cephalopods. So we're getting away from the human body here into the larger engineering research program. Cephalopods can edit their messenger RNA in real time. That's how they change their skin color, and octopi that change their skin color and texture. When they settle on like a coral, they'll change their color, their skin color and texture, and they're doing that by editing their messenger RNA in real time. Nobody knows how they do that. So that's pretty impressive. I mean, the results are incredible. There's a project that was done, I think, 2 summers ago, just published about a little over a year ago, where they took fruit flies, Drosophila, for those of you who are biologists. Fruit flies are one of the most studied organisms in the world because they don't vote, okay? And they got tired of doing research on yeast because everyone wants to do research on yeast for some reason. But they took these fruit flies in one field, like a fruit orchard. They put up tents. They put up, I think it was 13 tents around individual trees. And they sealed them so that the fruit flies that were in there couldn't get out. They couldn't get in or out. So the fruit flies that were in there were stuck in there. And I think they did sampling and DNA mapping like every couple of weeks on the fruit flies that were inside of those. And every one of those tents, every one of the 13, the fruit flies had exactly the same DNA changes after 4 months. Now, that's not random. Nobody knows how they're doing it. But it sure looks like they have mechanisms built into their system that allow them to detect something in their environment and make changes internally. That's astounding. And if that's true, and if that can be shown to be more generally true, then the whole field of population genetics has to get rewritten. I'm just kind of excited to watch that. Yeah.
I guess, to be more direct, do you think that this implies that microevolution doesn't exist at all, or plays a much smaller role? Or do you think that these mechanisms play a small role and microevolution might play a larger role?
It depends on, again, on what you mean by microevolution,
Well,
but
I guess specifically with regards to natural selection, for smaller, with regards to like mutations that are smaller and over shorter periods of time.
yeah. So the problem is that when you see a change, you can't tell whether it's a mutation or whether it was programmed, can you?
Is there a difference that's important?
Well, so yeah, so if it's programmed, well, let's go find out where that is. I mean, where's that program? So, but if it's random, so if it's a straight gamma ray that hits your DNA and it just happens to hit a stem cell that's turning into a sperm at just the right time, maybe it could change something in your DNA. I would guess almost all the time, just based on being an engineer, that that's going to destroy something rather than create something new. So it's very hard to see that generating anything new that's complex or beyond trivial, let's say. So there's no question that things like that happen. I mean, one of our causal factors is degradation. There's errors, gamma rays happen. You know, we all know that degradation happens. So you have these genetic errors in your family line. Most of us here can probably point to something. You know, we have a clotting problem in our family because of, you know, it's a factor 7 clotting problem, and that's genetic. So I don't think that was there. It's not there in everybody. So somebody had a degradation that happened. So is that microevolution? So that's a separate question, though, from natural selection. Natural selection says that the change that you see somehow makes you better able to survive or thrive or generate more offspring or something like that. And that, well, I mean, we know if you're living in the land of leopards and you're the slow runner, you don't have a lot of chances, okay? You're probably not going to last very long. But, you know, that's a hypothetical. We don't live in lands of leopards, and so we just don't know. We just don't know. So I don't know if you've read Darwin's book. I have taken it upon myself to suffer, so none of you have to. It's really not good. But Darwin himself never tries to explain these things. Even though he titled the book The Origin of Species, there's nothing in there about origination of new species except some thought experiments. So yeah, it can do some things. So if you have some genetic change and you're able to have 1,000 children, and each of your children is able to have 1,000 children, then you might take over. I could see that happening, but we don't know whether that change is random. You don't know. It's called a mutation, but that term comes from Darwinian orthodoxy. So it's a change? Absolutely, it's a change. We know that, but we don't know that it was random, and we don't know that it's a mutation in the random sense. It could be a program running in the background somewhere. So, but no one's asking that question, so we don't know.
I guess, and one final, response to what you said so far, what do you think about, plants? Because we know, that artificial selection is something that humanity has engaged in for thousands of years to create awesome foods like corn. And those things, I guess, corn plants, since they aren't they don't have as many external stimuli that they respond to, it's hard to see how this sort of intelligent, if the corn plant's internal intelligence would be able to change its DNA to make itself bigger over a period of generations, given that it wouldn't know that that's something that its environment would be, that would positively respond to in its environment. So I guess, what do you think about plants?
Yeah, so that's actually a really, really good question. So I'm going to stall for just a little while so I'll think of an answer. So what we know from, we all have dogs, or we have friends with dogs. I don't know that there's any genetic code that's has more plasticity than dogs. I mean, look at the incredible variety of dogs. Okay, so we know that we don't know exactly how all that works, but we can see, I mean, it's just obvious that there's all kinds of variation, and that's what Darwin saw. So if you read his book, Darwin addresses, he's really into pigeon breeding. Lots of variation in pigeons, but that's nothing compared to dogs. You can see it in almost all organisms. There's like a degree of plasticity that's available. And it's different for different organisms. So different plants have different amounts, different animals have different amounts. And we don't, as the current scientific community, we don't really understand how these things work very well. In fact, we really don't understand very much of anything when you get right down to it. So if you want to become a research scientist, there's a lot of opportunity. So that's clearly happening. It's clearly true that things are changing, right? But one of our research projects is, I think is going to be huge. It's probably a couple of years away from a publication, but we're looking at what our researchers call a gravity well. So organisms have sort of like a sweet spot. You know, a gravity well is like, as you fall into a high gravity system, you kind of do this thing. It's got this parabolic kind of shape to it. I'm not that sophisticated, so I just think of a rubber band. So if I put a pin in a piece of cardboard and through the rubber band, and then I stretch the rubber band in any direction, the farther I get away from the center point, the harder it's going to try to come back. Right? So I think something like that's going on with organisms, plants or animals, that they can adapt, they can change, but when they get the chance, they'll come right back. So you see that in the finches in the Galapagos that Darwin, that are touted with Darwin. He saw there was a drought and their beaks got thicker, right? So then he goes off and writes his book, but other researchers go and they notice as soon as the drought's over, the beaks go back to their normal size. That wasn't evolution, it wasn't random, it was programmed. They needed that to happen. They had something built in that made it happen, and then when they didn't need it anymore, they detected that and they reverted back to their norm. So I think when we get into this more, we're going to see a lot more of that kind of stuff. We're going to see a lot more of critters and plants reverting to the norm. We can push them outside their norm. They have to be able to detect the environment in order to do that. But when you turn the environment back to their normal environment, they'll come back. I think we'll see a lot of that. There's already quite a few research papers. We have, in our library, we have about 120 research papers that show that. So there's much more coming. So
yeah,
does that help?
Yeah, I guess in the cases you're talking about, my response to that would be that there is an evolutionary, that fits well within the evolutionary theory, especially with microevolution. But in the interest of time, I think I'm going to let this person out.
Okay, well, we can talk more. Yeah, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. This is interesting stuff. What is, in your experience, what's an effective question to ask a naturalist to spark conversation about intervention?
So that's an extremely good question, which I may be ill-equipped to answer. I'm not very good at effective, and I'm extremely bad at subtle. So I would just say, why are you so stupid? Now, this is where the effective part kind of doesn't work. But I would ask questions like, how do you know it's random? So I would find one of these papers that says that these changes are observed to be repeatable. So if an organism can go over here, come back, and go back to the same place again, come back, and this is based on DNA, and go over there again, that's not random anymore. So explain that, Mr. Professor. How's that? What's causing that? And if you don't have an answer for that, then anything you tell me, like trust us, we're scientists, or we haven't got there yet, but the research is promising, those are promissory notes, right? And if they can't answer the question, all they have to offer you is some form of promissory note or an appeal to authority. I'm your professor, get it right on the exam or I'll fail you. You know, so that's not a very good scientific argument. So our book has a lot of questions in it. We talk about questions about information. We talk about questions about coherence and interdependence. And I don't know, maybe there's probably 6, 7 dozen questions like that in that book. You know, how do you build a coherent system gradually? I'd really like to know. Darwin requires it to be gradual. There's a lot of biologists that don't believe that anymore, by the way. There's this group called the Third Way. They're looking for the third causal force that I said doesn't exist. But they're looking for things like horizontal gene transfer. Well, that does happen. So you can take a whole bunch of genetic material and just move it from one organism to another. Viruses do this all the time. But that doesn't explain where the information came from in the first place, right? It just tells you, so if things are designed in a modular way, could I take a whole system from one organism and transport it to another? So, I mean, there's homologies. Another huge argument for evolution is that, you know, the bones in our hand look very similar to the bones in a bat's wing. They look very similar to the bones in a whale's flippers, in their, whatever they call those fins, dorsal fins, whatever no, it's not dorsal. Whatever, I'll get a zoologist in here to help later. But you've got these similarities, and people think that suggests common descent, right? So these all came from a single precursor ancestor, you know, back however many millions of years ago. My view, I'm a software guy. What I see is the same program with different parameters. I can take the same bones, and by changing the parameters for how they're interconnected, their length, their strength, how hollow or how light they are versus thick, and I can change all those parameters, and I can turn that set of bones into just about anything I want. So if there was a designer that's better than me, I would expect that would be trivial for that designer, because I know how to do it. So therefore, it can't be too hard. So does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
There's millions of questions. So I would recommend, if you really want to get into this, I would keep a log of questions and just think about it. Go read an article in USA Today about the latest, greatest biology discovery or something. They're all over the place, and they're always messed up. But go read it and just start asking questions, or take, like I did, with just that simple equation for cellular respiration. How many questions can I find just in that formula? Where does this come from? How does it get over here? How does it change from this formula, chemical formula, into this chemical formula? That's a hard thing to do. Where does that come from? So just every time you look at something, start asking questions. You'll get really good at it. It's really easy. Yeah, I don't have a lot of answers. I'm really good at questions.
Thank you so much for your talk, Mr. Laufmann. I feel like I can feel the cells in my body. You made me so aware.
When do you get to the sexual reproduction chapter?
No, let's not go there. I'm very interested in medical technology, and I'm just thinking about how all these things, you mentioned, one problem fails and we get death, and I'm thinking about like how with our technology now we can almost fix these problems. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on medical technology and where it's headed and what it's doing right now from both an evolutionary perspective and a design perspective.
That's an extremely thoughtful question. Never ask it again. So that is a really good question, because the money these days in biological research is all in medicine. I mean, if you're doing medical research, you can write your own check almost. I mean, everybody, the pharmaceutical companies, the government, everybody's pouring money. Because if you can find a genetic link between a human gene and the efficacy of a drug or a treatment, then you can decide who will respond best to which treatments. So I have a buddy who's got a startup company in this area. It's just incredibly rich area, rich in both in great ideas and new research and rich in actual dollars. So if you want to go into this is a great area. But it's, I mean, you could like buy shoes for your kids and stuff. It's an incredibly rewarding area because we don't really understand how the human body works. We can observe if I push it over here, this thing over here turns red. Okay, that's like I'm treating the body like a black box. And my co-author, who's a hospice physician, that's basically what the medical community does. They don't really understand very much about what's going on. They just know if they give you 20 milligrams of this and 10 milligrams of that your condition, 80% of the time, the condition you have is going to get better. They don't know why. Sometimes they know a little bit of why. But all of those are open questions under the hood. So now I've totally lost the question you asked. And I'm hoping somewhere in there I answered it.
Yeah, I think just like the fact that our bodies are sort of moldable. Like we can do things and it fixes things. So what implications does that have?
Yeah. So there are sort of two answers to that. One is sort of the theistic view, and one is the materialistic view. Okay, so the theistic view is I can help treat illnesses. I might be able to take a child still in the womb and fix a genetic disorder before that baby is even born. I mean, that would be so sweet, wouldn't it? I mean, we could save so much suffering and pain, post-birth surgeries, and if we could just detect that condition and fix it. Then there's the materialist view, which is I want to live forever, so I want to clone my cells and find a way to transport my consciousness into my clone. Or I want to live inside of it as an AI program inside of a machine somewhere. Let me just tell you, someone's going to pull the plug. Don't even bother. It's not worth it. But that's one is a very light vision, a very happy vision. One's got darkness all over in it. And so I think this is the difference between the worldviews. When you're a biblical theist or an evangelical Christian or Catholic or even a Jew, you've got a light. The world is filled with light. If you're going down this other path where the material stuff of the universe is all that exists, there is no God, there's nothing outside, then it drives you down this path which is nihilistic and dark. And I'm against it. Then there's a lot of people doing research like that too. So, sorry, that was a downer. Okay.
Thank you.
Since it's 8:30 and we want to respect everybody's time, but no, keep your questions because we're going to have one-on-one after, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I'll be here to sign books. I'll stay as long as you want. It's already way past my bedtime, so it doesn't matter anymore at this point.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dr. Laufmann.
Thank you. And there's no doctor. It's just thank you.